Hello, everyone. In this lecture, I will be going over moral development in childhood. So moral development is an important piece of development in early school-aged children in particular, and it requires development in three areas. First, emotions. With emotions, children need to have the capacity to know that others have emotions and to care about those emotions. Once they're able to do so, they can begin to feel emotions like anxiety, guilt, and remorse when engaging in immoral or negative behavior. As you know, these are uncomfortable emotions, and as such, should motivate the child to no longer engage in behaviors that caused them. Second is knowledge. The child needs to become knowledgeable of their family's overall moral code, so what their family deems right and wrong. And third is action. Children must learn to take appropriate actions in order to inhibit negative impulses. For example, their impulses may tell them to hit the child who took a toy from them, but they need to have an alternative behavior to express their anger or frustration in that moment. So the child would have to learn regulatory behaviors like deep breathing or taking space, and perhaps asking for help to avoid the negative action. Together, each of these contributes to the internalization of morals and accordingly moral development. I'll be providing you with an overview of 5 different perspectives on moral development, which are discussed in depth in your text. These theories provide perspectives on the process through which children's morality develops, not the specific morals or values children hold or should hold, since that is a very individual or familial choice. Remember that different cultures will emphasize different morals, and that even within a given culture, the morals that are expressed and modeled may differ. We'll begin with learning theories. So as you may recall, learning theories suggest that learning occurs through modeling and reinforcement. Accordingly, morals would also develop based on what's observed and what is reinforced according to this perspective. For example, if a child engages in a behavior that the family deems positive or pro-social, such as sharing a toy, the positive reinforcement that follows would encourage the child to begin to internalize that pro-social moral in order to receive more of that positive reinforcement. At the opposite end, a negative behavior, such as throwing a tantrum, if responded to with a negative consequence, like a timeout, is likely to be internalized as wrong. Of course, this learning by reinforcement takes time and consistency, and probably lots of frustration by the parent. It can also be complicated because what one family considers moral may be different from what another family or another setting views as moral. Take, for example, hitting. In a child's home, hitting may be seen as an appropriate reaction to having something taken away from you, but at school, it clearly would not be. This can cause some confusion to the child regarding which behavior is acceptable. Part of internalizing morals is part of internalizing morals is remembering being disciplined in the past for doing wrong and having that motivate you to avoid that behavior moving forward. By avoiding that behavior, they avoid the tension associated with knowing they're going to get punished. This is called avoidance conditioning. Modeling is also a powerful tool for moral development according to learning theory. Children learn by observing others engage in moral or immoral behaviors. They also learn by observing the consequences, positive or negative, that come from these behaviors. Based on this theory, external rewards, reinforcement, and pro-social parental or caregiver behavior are especially important for moral development. Next, we'll look at cognitive development theory. So whereas learning theory focuses on behaviors, cognitive theories focus on the cognitive processes involved with making meaning out of a situation and making a decision about what should be done. In the early stages of moral development, children determine right from wrong based on what authority figures tell them. This is a concept called heteronomous morality. This form of morality involves very black or white thinking. Doing 2 wrong things is worse than doing 1 wrong thing, regardless of the intensity of that bad thing or the intentions behind it. If it caused harm, it equals bad. As they develop further, children begin to enter into autonomous morality, where they can begin to consider the intention behind the behavior and the consequence for the self and others when making moral judgments. For example, if the intention behind pushing someone was to protect someone else, it would be judged a bit differently. Kohlberg's stages of moral development add further nuance to the relation between cognitive development and moral development. I've linked a video that I found especially useful in understanding Kohlberg's stages onto Canvas for you. At its most basic, what you can pull from this video and your text is that early school-aged children are in the pre-conventional stage, where their understanding of morals and right and wrong behavior is based on the consequences that will come from that behavior. This makes a lot of sense when we remember the importance of learning theory and operant conditioning at this age. Based on this theory, consequences and discussion of the effects of behaviors on all involved parties are especially important for moral development. Now, with psychoanalytic theory, you may recall that this theory emphasizes the personality structures of the id, ego, and superego. As a refresher, the id seeks pleasure, the superego is concerned with rules and social conventions, telling us which behaviors are right and which ones are wrong. And the ego attempts to balance the two by finding acceptable ways to satisfy needs. With that in mind, moral development is closely tied to the development of the superego, which happens around age 5. This is the part of the personality that makes you feel anxious or guilty when you think about doing something bad. But in order to feel that way, you need to know that the behavior is actually bad. So this is where parenting comes in, to teach you right from wrong consistently so you can begin to internalize these rules in your superego. Consistent with what we learned about discipline last week, this does not mean harshly parenting or punishing the child. Based on this theory, offering parental warmth, modeling pro-social behavior, debriefing consequences, and reinforcing pro-social behavior are important for moral development. Okay, now object relations. According to object relations theory, moral development begins earlier in the infancy period. Further, rather than being guided by balancing between learned rules and seeking of pleasure, it has to do much more with perceptions of self and social interactions. First, with the self, we want to be able to love and accept ourselves, and this requires refraining from engaging in behaviors that we would deem harmful to our perception of self. A limitation here is that the theory doesn't quite tell us where the idea of what is good or bad comes from. Like there are many who think that stealing would not reflect poorly on the self. Anyway, in addition to wanting to preserve a positive view of self, object relations theory also suggests that moral development comes out of concern for others. Basically, we want to have and maintain feelings of connection, trust, and security with others that are similar to what we had with early caregivers. Though this isn't discussed in your book, I suppose it would suggest that if you had an unhealthy relationship with your caregivers, that would act as your model for interactions with others in the same way. Based on this theory, early loving relationships with a sensitive caregiver are especially important for moral development. Finally, the evolutionary perspective suggests that some degree of moral intuition exists at birth, meaning we inherently know right from wrong to some degree. But it is not until later that we figure out how to engage in moral reasoning to evaluate things like intentions and consequences. In a sense, this is similar to what Kohlberg suggests about the stages of moral development, though it asserts that at its foundation, morality is innate. Evidence for this moral intuition comes from considering that it would be evolutionarily adaptive to work together as a group, meaning that you would have been, and I suppose continue to be, more likely to survive if you get help from others. So then we are unconsciously attuned to other people and inherently want to act in pro-social ways to maintain those connections. Based on this theory, group relations and cooperation are especially important for moral development. Okay, so those are the perspectives of moral development very briefly and are gone over, of course, in much more depth in your textbook, and we can discuss further in class, but let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.